Hi. Welcome everybody to this week's ODI Fridays lunchtime lecture. So just a couple of ground rules before we get going. So we are broadcasting live on the internet. Camera there, microphone here. When we do questions later on, I'll pass around the mic. The mic is so people at home can hear. It doesn't amplify my voice. I am this quiet naturally. The people who are watching along on live, I know there's a few of you, tweet along, hashtag ODI Fridays, tweet along in the room, hashtag ODI Fridays. People at home, when we're taking questions as well, we're watching that hashtag so we can ask some questions and bring that audience into the room here. So today's lecture is from Paul Downey, or at PSD on Twitter, Paul Downey from the Government Digital Service. It's about some of the work going on, especially in Cabinet Office, led by Cabinet Office and the Government Data Programme, to help build that data infrastructure for the UK that we in the ODI talk about a lot. The team there are actually building a lot of that stuff, a lot of that groundwork for us within government. It's groundbreaking stuff. Those of us who watched last week's lecture, one of those ones where we talked about our cat register, a bit of a cure for the Friday blues. But it's also one of those silly little things we're doing to explore some of these ideas and see it. But today we're going to hear a little bit more about the team are doing, the work they've done so far, and what's coming. So I'll pass over to Paul.
Okay, thank you. Hello, I'm Paul. As Peter said, I'm from the Government Digital Service, which is part of the Cabinet Office. I'm a real-life civil servant. The talk I wanted to talk about was, but I didn't feel brave enough to put in the abstract, is registers, boring but necessary. And I went to a hack day the other week, accountability hack, where the Parliamentary Digital Service were there. And Dan Barrett said this amazing thing, which has stuck in my head since. And it's kind of what way we sort of feel about what we're doing. I think we've got quite a big vision about what we're trying to do, but actually the way that we get there is by doing some small things that are transformative. So what do we mean by government? So the Government Digital Service, one of the things we did early on was to look at the way that government publishes information. And driven by a nice letter from Martha Lane Fox, we produced this sort of single domain for government. And so the mantra was, people shouldn't really need to understand government to interact with it. And so here's I won't say one-stop shop, but one place to go where most of that information is available. And some of the things, the needs that are satisfied or we aim to help with are pretty mainstream. What to do when somebody dies is something I imagine we all, don't want to visit, but when you're in that situation, you can really empathise with people who do visit that page. And making that information really clear really helps a lot of users. Government publishes a lot of information about itself and what it thinks and what it's going to do. So this is before gov.uk. There were 14 odd policies on what the government's going to do in Afghanistan. And by bringing people together on a single platform, a single place, it sort of allowed them to sort of start to work together and sort of produce one statement for what the government was going to do. Something that's really in our ethos and is something that wasn't there right from the start, but although we talked about it, I think I can sort of safely thank Lisa Reichardt, who's now working for the Australian Digital Service, was really making us be more honest about using user research. And user research, actually confronting yourself with the people who are trying to use your thing, is the thing I've learned most from working at GDS. And I would never try and make something now without actually watching people use it or talk to them. One of the things we do know is, and this is a thing, is that most people have a sort of a perception of government as being like one thing, one place to go. And in reality, it's very federated. And that's because of organisational structures. Quite often big organisations are federated and there are sort of lots of fiefdoms and things going on. But a lot of this is around democratic needs. So for democracy, some things are separate. Doesn't mean that we can't sort of try and make it clearer about how that works. So on gov.uk is a list of government organisations. So that's one definition of what we mean by government. But a lot of these things are partitioned by geography. This is something I'd love to have the data for. It's one map. There are many models and many maps in government. I really like this one. It's a PDF, which is a list of all the geographies in the UK. So sometimes, you might think I can build a list of schools, but actually, schools are managed by Welsh government differently to they're managed by Scotland and to England. So Department of Education just does England. So, And then there are things like, there's lots of things on vellum. So legislation is got lists in there. This is a statutory instrument that's published once a year. I've met some of the people who wrote this thing, and they do obsess about where the goes and the names of organisations. But some of those names are different to the ones on gov.uk, and they're different ones on websites. It's one of those things we have to deal with. And if you think a government organisation is, I'm sort of saying that's a little bit wafty. Actually, what you might think of as a public body is definitely a movable feast. So the list of organisations who can buy services from the Crown Commercial Services Digital Marketplace is a list of government agencies, organisations, it's schools, it's academies, it's charities funded to some level, I think 50%. And so that kind of business rules that determines what they think of as a public body is different to the business rules which determine what Land Registry thinks of as a government, or, as a government organisation, or and so forth. So when it comes to transforming government, we definitely in GDS we're definitely thinking about primarily around central government things which are on gov.uk. But that doesn't mean that we can't have an impact elsewhere and help work with others elsewhere who are in the wider public sector or even commercial sector, I guess. And we've had a few goes at sort of trying to understand how to change the way that give people better tools to make better services for users. One of them was a program. So a program means a set piece of work over a period of time. So for 2 years, we worked with 25 services and tried to transform them. And I think whenever you see a service, or you see you hear a register and you hear a platform, we're going to talk about those in a second, remember there's a team behind those, that's a group of people. And something we definitely believe is that group of people, there's a unit of responsibility, they're the ones who decide what gets made. And a digital team is not just a group of technology people or a group of policy people. It's all those people smooshed together. Anybody can make something, anybody can buy something, but to make or buy the right thing, you need a very diverse team. And so one of the examples I worked on was in the Land Registry. We started quite late because we had a false start. But at some point we said, okay, well, let's try and build a concept of what the Land Registry could be like in a digital age. And we had a team which had all those people in it. We had lawyers, we had operational staff, we had caseworkers. It was mostly Land Registry. There was a few sort of people from GDS in there, and we brought people in from outside. And it was great. It was really amazing place to work, and I learned loads. And I'm forever grateful for the people from Land Registry I worked with, all of which who really cared about that institution. They're working in a modern office, so they are obviously thinking about becoming for the modern age themselves. They have their own typeface, that's a thing. They used to be in this building in Lincoln's Field Inn, which I loved, but they're now in that new office. So they have a history, and they've been around for a while. I think it's 150 years. And what they do is fundamentally, 150 years old. It's basically government cared enough about ownership of property and to back that up, to create a register, a list of who owns what in the country. And a lot of this language, that we use when we talk about registers in general, comes from what we learned by working with Land Registry. One of the things they do is they build an index map. They have an authoritative register, and then they have an index map. And you can see some of those things as open data on gov.uk. This is my hero, Theodore Burton Fox-Ruoff. He's a chief land registrar in the 60s, and in the 80s, in his retirement, he wrote those books. One of my favourite is The Solicitor and the Silicon Chip. And in his books, he sort of set out some principles about what the land registry was about, what a register should do. And obviously, he was thinking about land, but some of these things are quite general. So the first thing is, it should be a true reflection of what's going on. Now, obviously, all data is biased, and the bias of the land registry is transacting on land. But it's useful to know what the bias is, and if you can follow the law and see what's going on, and there's an organisation making sure that's right, that's great. The second principle, I think this is really important, and I've seen this. I really like some of the writings of the ODI, and especially particularly data spectrum. But this is quite binary. It's saying stuff's either open, and to transact on land, you need to know what you can buy and sell. And then some of that stuff's sensitive, and you should keep that behind closed doors, behind the curtain. And then the third one is, and this is quite a good reminder, if government cares enough to create a list of things that it's going to call a register, there's a reason for that. It's probably some legal consequence to it being wrong, and in this case, it's backing up your house to the value of the house. Actually, land registry will back your ownership of the house to the value of your house. So how do we get there? So I'm going to plant a few mental models into your head, and these may not stick, but I'll have a go. And the first one is this one. So I think by and large there's sort of three things that you sort of see from government in terms of services. And the first one is content. So in gov.uk, what to do when somebody dies, policy on Afghanistan, just made for everybody to read. Then there's this thing called, there's a thing called services, and that's more like the kind of Amazon checkout. It's just between you and government. You're interacting with government, and we're very strong on that services are verbs. They're transactions. They're things you do, like apply for a passport, renew my driving license, pay my tax. And then there's this thing in the middle, which is what you might call tools. And this is something I don't think we're doing very well on, if I'm to be honest with you. And there are lots of these things out there, but they're kind of like where you're looking at data or documents and you're trying to craft a query and just find the ones you want. And I think that's neglected, but that's something that we can try and look into. So if we were going to change government, how and help government change itself, how do you do that for less money without too much having a massive team? So after the 25 exemplar programme, we had a retrospective, and retrospectives are like, well, we all did our best work during that time. Let's not have a blame. Let's just say, if we're going to do this again, what will we do to make that better? And I think it was Mark Foden gave a video on gubbins and government, and it's a really good video. I recommend it to you. And somehow that incepted a lot of people. So whenever we talked about this, we couldn't help but draw this diagram. It's a bit like the mashed potato in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. We're all sort of drawing this in various guises. Sometimes a circular, sometimes in a perspective, but they were always this thing. And it's this layered model. And the idea is that at the top, you need services which can bubble and boil, react to what users need. Very adaptable. They can come and go. It's okay if they overlap. And then you've got this kind of platform layer. So government has 780 services, say. It depends on how you count them. But it had 700 contracts for taking payments. So making a shared platform where government can take payments means that one place can be reactive. So when a new thing comes along, contactless payment or payment to the post office or whatever, you can add it and it'll be there for all the services at once. So again, reminding you that these are all teams. And then at the bottom is this thing called registers, which is basically the data you can trust and that's going to be around for a lot longer. So I kind of sketched this out a little bit to sort of show the layering, but registers are really boring. They're just literally the data. But the services are things that you would interact with and should change and whatever. And then because they're quite boring and quite federated, you do need some things to index them, as in the index map on the land registry. And behind all this is another thing which we wouldn't have got anywhere without Liam Maxwell really attacking the way that we procure stuff and that we deal with technology. And to change some of the things which are built together into things that you can assemble from the bits. You need lots of help on really boring things like contracts and just the way that we procure stuff. And so, really what we're trying to do is create like a choreography, rules and principles which allow people to work it out, rather than some kind of top-down sort of, you will do it this way. And if the services are verbs, then the things that we're going to talk about today are the nouns, the registers. And so in legislation, I found with John Sheridan's help, found 900 odd things which sort of smelt like a register. And quite often they're not written a register, they're written list or, list of or whatever. But government does care about lots of things. These are just some things I found that smelt like registers. And if government cares about vehicles, so it has an organisation which tracks which vehicles are on the road. And it cares about land ownership, because it's trying to help you, and it cares about passports. So those things are all kind of lists. How much of that's behind the curtain and how much of it is open is to be decided, obviously. This brilliant book is The Clock Along Now by Stuart Brand, who's thinking very much about long term. He's building a clock, or there's a team building a clock, which will tick every year and chime every millennia. And so he's obviously thinking about the nature of things. And, this is a pace layering. And so I applied that model to what we're doing in government with that mashed potato diagram. And, really services are very reactive, have to be very reactive. And platforms are meeting the needs of services. So by and large, the users of a platform are the teams making services. And registers, well, they're not always looking upwards. They're quite often looking downwards. You've been instructed to keep this list. And so services are the verbs which act upon registers, but the shape of what a register is quite often, in law. Now, that doesn't always lead to a good outcome. So there's lots of these things around. I just picked this one at random. Paper forms in which the things you're asked for are text. And if you just put that onto the web as a digital thing and just made that a text box, you end up with where we are now, which is, so in open data, I've found 12 different spellings of Scotland, because those things are just recorded as people type them. And sometimes people will defend this. They'll say, our duty is to record what people said, not what they meant. So I had a go at trying to tackle this with standards. So I put a challenge to the Open Standards Board, who can set open standards for government, and said, there are 12 spellings of Scotland. Can we not find a code that identifies a country? And I sort of went into this sort of world of what standards people call bike shedding. Lots of people were very confident that their opinion was right. And lots of people told me reasons why we couldn't have a code, that we couldn't say definitively government doesn't recognise Taiwan as a country or Palestine as a thing. And actually, it turns out we're quite clear about that. After a lot of looking around on gov.uk, I found this chap, Tony Warren, who's works on geographical naming policy and sits on a permanent committee for geographical naming and has interactions with the ISO 3166-2 committee and asks things like, what code do we use for Kosovo? We recognise Kosovo, but the UN doesn't. And he's a bit of a geek on names and codes. And when he gets stuck, he doesn't have to make things up. He doesn't have to bike shed. He can ring up Ivory Coast and say what you called Ivory Coast, because he knows people in Ivory Coast. He sits in front of all those desks. So here's a person who's perfect to make our authoritative register of what we call countries in the UK, or what HMG calls countries. So this is where we're going. Is we're trying to create like these nouns, country.register.gov.uk. So it's a place you can go for that one thing, that one sort of little small thing. And it turns out there's 199 records. That means 199 countries, and there's 205 entries. I'll explain why. So an entry. So we do this thing where we don't update things. We append to it, and so an entry is a change, is a statement. And those statements are grouped together by the key, which is the country code, the ISO 3166-2 country code. And you can see there's 205 entries, and these are things added. This is one entry. This is one that's fairly new. So it turned, I don't know if you know, but the Czech Republic changed its name fairly recently. So the government still says the official name is Czech Republic, but the name you would use in a document or a letter will be Czechia. And you can find, given a code, just those entries. You can sort of see the history of things changing. Now, we can geek out about that, but I'll save that maybe for questions. And so, given the other thing to say is each entry has got a fingerprint, and this will be quite familiar to people who are into Git or blockchain or other things. You can identify where it came from, and if you change the data, then you change the fingerprint, so it's a different thing. And you can also get the data in different representations. So you can get it as JSON if you're a developer, CSV if you're in spreadsheet land, TSV if you're in shell script land, and Turtle if you're in RDF world. So that's basically our strategy, is just try and pick some of these lists and just fix them one at a time. And hopefully as we do these lists, things get a little bit better. We're not going to just change government overnight. That's not going to happen. But if we can make a few of these lists, then we'll start to pull away at at the mess, if you like. So how do we make that happen? We've got a small team. We're calling it's a highfalutin name, but the Register Design Authority. So basically, we're trying to say, we're trying to control or edit or curate registers. And we're building a service. So each register appears in a register of registers. And so the service we're building to update the register of registers is a service to actually assess whether registers should be a thing. And we've written some guidance on gov.uk. That's the primary place to go to find out about registers. And so I really enjoyed your talk, Peter. I mean, it was really good because you actually alluded to a lot of the things we've been thinking about, but through the comedy value of cats in government. Government talks about cats, and so could we make this a register? And I just picked this as a thing to talk about, which goes through some characteristics. So we talk about things being canonical, and that's a bit of a fancy pants word for saying, are you the source of truth? Right. So there are lots of data is by and large made by people observing things, right? And we're trying to tighten that up a bit and sort of say, okay, if you're part of the process that creates a government department or creates a school or creates a cat in government, a government cat, you should be that should be the one place, when you're making those things, when you're recording those things, you should the person who lists those things, because anybody can observe things and you might get bored observing them. But being the person who's in charge of that bureaucracy, that thing that makes the thing exist, that gives you power. And the other thing is, so you can see where I'm going with this, the cat register. I'm sorry, Peter. What's the reason for them to exist? Can you have a cat in government without being on the register? I think possibly you could. But maybe we could write legislation to say you can't have a government cat without going to the cat registrar and registering on the register, at which point then we'll do it. The other thing is, quite often, when something's not nailed down, when there isn't a register, there are lots of these observations. So we found this with countries. We found 16 lists of countries on gov.uk and in services which had differences. And we found it with local authorities. Local authorities is a little bit more subtle in that the meaning of a boundary is different to the meaning of the local authority as an organisation. So some of these are legitimate and possibly are other possible registers. But we sort of compare and contrast those things. I think, as far as I know, yours is the only cat register around, so you're doing quite well there. The other thing is, there are kind of minimal thing about that thing, because you want to trust that other people are recording the things that you're pointing to. So we have this process which we're documenting. So each register is basically a standards process. It's like, how does this thing become a thing you can trust? So we grab a custodian, a person who's making those things. So in the case of local authorities, we found this guy, Steve McAllister, who's in DCLG and Departments for Communities and Local Government. And he's writing statutory instruments. And he's working quite hard at the moment on Manchester, because Manchester is going through consultation and thinking about how it's going to be reorganised. So if he doesn't, I wouldn't say he creates local authorities, but he's pretty close to the point where local authorities are made, because he's creating those documents, those vellum, which says that here the things are. So when we talked to him, there were quite a lot of people excited about this, who said, oh yeah, you should have the website in there, you should have the email address, you should have the lots of things. And so suddenly this data gets quite baggy and wide, and every time somebody said that, Steve was getting more and more nervy, because he doesn't track websites and he doesn't track email addresses, but he does track what local government organisation exists and what they're called. So he can just do that. And then we can create another list, which is, here's a list of the websites, and point them back to that list of organisations. And so this brings us to another point, which is they're alive. So there's a team behind each register, or a person behind each register. And that's because now there'll always be latencies. Things take a while to be agreed. It took a while to agree that Czechia was a country. So it was the name for the country of Czech Republic. But if you sort of, rather than taking your list of countries from Wikipedia and then forgetting to update it and never realising Czechia's changed its name, it's quite nice to go to the authoritative source, and then you can build your service and have a drop down of countries, or a country picker that's using live data. And that demands looking at lots of registers, because, as I've been alluding to, this is quite federated and split apart. And then if you build a form to create a new thing, a service, so here's a prospective service to register a pet shop, by picking from the register, the data you're making doesn't contain those spelling errors. It contains codes, and those codes can be linked back to the register. And at least these become statements in time, which are more trustworthy, we hope, than just having text. And so to make that world work, we do sort of need a little bit of design. We need to argue about one of the hardest problems in computing, which is what to name things. So I know your cat register was pretty close to what we would do, apart from a few fields which we can nerd out about. But for example, you have start date as one word, whereas we use start-date, so it's just literally just tweaking a few things. Then suddenly, once everybody's using start date, you can start to do things generically across all registers. So, when was this country established? Recognised? When was this company established? If they're all using the word start date, then you can start to sort of do stuff with that. This kind of view comes from something called microformats, which I spent a lot of time thinking about in the past. So the other thing we do is the names of the registers, we try and make those nouns, we make those meaningful as possible. So you can see that schools, the Department for Education are working on an alpha for schools, so it's a school ing, because they only do English schools. But company's house company numbers are they're definitely a thing. So this is what's called a query, which is there's a W3C spec for it. And so what you do is you turn that prefix into a URL, and you add that on the end, and you've got a URL. So these are URLs, but they're kind of convenient URLs. So I had a go at sort of thinking about how that could help content. So a lot of content on gov.uk is written in Markdown, and this is like a really hand-wavy, wafty proposal, but I think it's got some legs. So you could say, in a Markdown document, you could say the Czech Republic is country : CZ. And in Markdown, I don't know if you know, but you can, at the bottom of your document, create an index of all the things you've cited. And so you say, okay, the country CZ is actually the page on gov.uk for the Czech Republic. And so the hyperlink you've produced, it's got a human-readable name, and it's got a human-readable page to visit, but the country called CZ is a sort of persistent, reliable identifier for the country. And that's the kind of things we think where the value of registers comes from. It's like not things we've really thought about very carefully. Just having things solid means that lots of other people can work out and do interesting things with it. So if you go back to the list of what is government, Crown Commercial Service has a list of people who can buy from government a 2.91 megabyte spreadsheet, and that could be reduced quite a lot by just having queries in there saying you can buy from this agency, this local authority, this school, and point to the registers. So this is pretty nerdy. But I think this comes back to what we learned at Land Registry, working with Land Registry, was the importance of that system of record. I think Sean Bean in Goldeneye talks about blowing up the Land Registry, amongst other places, to take Britain back to the Stone Age. So it shows the importance of this data. And so basically, the trouble is, in the digital world, as John Sheridan will tell you, actually keeping data alive is really hard. So I don't even know, these tapes here were sold with pictures of steamrollers running over them, but they might survive a steamroller, but didn't survive my shed. So it's really just down to the fact that it's the data that matters, not the technology. The technology isn't that interesting. It's like a here and now thing. It's a service concern. But actually what we're really after is the data, making that data long-lived. And Land Registry knew this. This is a document, not they're a digital organisation now, but they used to run these things called land certificates. This is what a title used to look like. And Land Registry staff were taught how to tie knots, so you could tell whether this had been tampered with, and they probably could tell which office tied the knot. So we want that same sort of thing. We want digital knots. What can we do with there? And here again, the blockchain kind of world. There's lots of things going on there which are really interesting. One of the technologies they use, or the algorithms, or I don't know what the right word is, but is a Merkle tree, and that's an efficient way of saying, is my thing in this list of things? And doing that with a high degree of integrity. And Phil Potter wrote about this, blogged about this. I'll send some links at the end. But we worked with Google's certificate transparency team and friends in Cheltenham to think about how we could make that work well. And then the other problem we've got in government is there's lots of psychic paper. Here's my passport, here's my driving licence, here's my fishing licence. And, this is an amazing thing. So Food Standards Agency are a brilliant organisation who really think hard about their public task, which is to stop us from getting sick from food. And this is a really good thing they put out. I'm sure we all know about it. But, every now and then they pop up on eBay for, $3.99, and then, they swap them. But so can we make those things a bit more digital, or have a link to the blog? And obviously we sort of made this prospective design working with some of those Food Standards Agency people. This is very early on, and it's not a thing, it's just an idea. But can we find ways of teasing back to the register from physical artefacts? So we talked about the curtain, the cats, and I don't think there's much sensitive in the cat register. And I think there might be some data in the cat register which you've observed or found elsewhere, but really we're trying to get to things being the authoritative list rather than being statistics. And the custodian, there you are. So I'm not sure that I would say that a cat register is a real thing. I'm sorry, Peter. I have to apologise badly about that. The other thing I think where you're doing well, though, is on feedback. So for registers to work, you must respond to feedback. So at the moment, the latencies in addresses, for example, has every service assuming that the address that you drop down isn't going to be found, and here you can enter it again. And the world we want to build is that one where that is fed back to the register rather than the service having to capture all the addresses. It's kept separately, so we can improve the data at its source. So you can see there's a lot of work involved in this, even though the things we're doing at practical are quite small. The place to start is our guidance. I've put together a very informal page, a project page, which you can find out more about what we're doing. This is really aimed primarily at ourselves to remember all the things we've said. But yeah, you can visit our link and see what we're doing. And that's my talk. Thank you. I'm sure we have some questions.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
So start off questions in the room. Just say who you are and speaking to that.
Vinny Gupta, formerly of Ethereum. So, simple question. Why not just one really big hairy register that stores everything?
Well, inside government. Well, there's quite a few problems with that. I mean, I think the thing I was saying about democracy, I think that's quite important. That we've built this thing called Gov UK Verify, which is about trying to vouch who you are to government when you're going to pay your tax. Am I really the person who's going to pay my tax? And that was made very carefully with lots of participation from people who cared about identity and privacy and other things, and they have some quite strong principles around that. And one of those things, is it came off the back of there not being a single identity card for people in the UK. So, if you look at the Estonian model, where it's still federated, but they have one system, one number for people. We don't do that in the UK. So the list of your persona as the keeper of a vehicle is different to your persona as a landowner. And that's just the way we are. So putting everything into one box kind of pulls apart on that. And then the other thing is also, it's just domain knowledge. So the principle of creating a passport is very different to creating a driver license. It's very different to creating a land registry title. And the process you go through to do that is different. I mean, maybe you could have one, blockchain or something, or list that was where it was all recorded. But I think that would work for things in front of the curtain, maybe. But things behind the curtain, I think I'll get very nervous about that.
So there's partitioning.
Yeah.
So there's partitioning to maintain that's being done at kind of data separation level rather than, say, a cryptographic level.
I think also devolution is a thing. We're thinking about devolution from the get-go. We're thinking about schools being maintained by England and Wales. And, what happens if schools maintained by Manchester? And, could we tear registers apart as well as pull them together? So we're sort of really thinking quite carefully. Yeah, and long term, I mean, this is way beyond what we're thinking. But, private sector probably has a part to play in things. And so could we sort of set a standard that other people could fulfill? And we could just trust their register. So I think this partitioning is really important.
Cool.
Okay.
So just take a question that's just come in through Twitter from Beck Strickland. She's kind of relevant as well to that last bit there. What happens if Czechia splits in two? How do registers adapt to that kind of, not just a change of name, but to a change of the entity?
So it's something that I thought, so at the start of it, if I was put in charge of government, which I'm not, there's a different career path for that. So we just model the way things are. So actually the way that country IDs are managed is not in our hands, actually. It's in the hands of the ISO 31665 committee. So really it's down to what they decide. And the way that the identifiers we have for schools are managed is, I've just neglected this side of the audience. So the way that schools, identifiers for schools are managed is not always the way you might expect. So sometimes, like when schools converted from a school to academy, sometimes they keep the same edge-based number, and other times they get a new one. And that's a case-by-case basis quite often. It's like, do you want a new identifier or not? And so I think registers, we can probably, as going forward, we could probably tighten some of that best practice up or learn from each other. But at the moment, we're just trying to record things the way they are and the way they're managed. Is that a good answer? I'm not sure. It's quite a big subject, that, actually.
So it comes in.
Yeah.
Question here at the front.
Oh, hello. My name's Hugh Barnard. Actually, funnily enough, this follows on from Vinay's question and comment. It actually seems to me that since you're standardizing all the data names, et cetera, you are actually building something that is virtually not monolithic, but interoperable over the whole set of it. And I'm just wondering what kind of manpower is put into the ethics of privacy, into the layering of what's private, what's public, because it seems to me that there is a potential problem in this whole thing.
So can I reassure you that the thing we're working on here is definitely in front of the curtain, and different tools and techniques and probably technology will be applied to data that's private, right? So quite often with open data, we want people to take copies of it because actually we want Horcruxes, we want data all over the place. So if something goes bang in the middle, then we can work out whether things are out there or not. But when it comes to private data, well, it's a different model. It's sort of like things tend to be in one place, and usually you ask questions about data rather than actually getting copies of the data. So, at the moment, my daughter has got a driving license to get a drink, not because she wants to drive, because she wants to get a drink. So she shows random bouncers her name, her date of birth, home address, and whether she can drive a tank and whether she's got endorsements to get a drink. And that kind of minimalising the amount of data that's exchanged is something that another team are thinking about.
Sorry, just to ask a supplementary question, what sort of kind of size and manpower have you got working on that?
Well, we're a small team, so it's early days. I mean, in terms of, there are lots of people thinking about. So one of the brilliant things about being in the Cabinet Office is you can learn from government. So lots of things going on across government. There's people working with blue badges. There's people working with in Home Office, and we can talk to those people and we can learn from them and try and build patterns, establish patterns across them. There is a team looking at that patterns at the moment, and there are people actually making things which are things which you could take forward. So I mean, our team is very small, but government's quite big.
Okay, thank you.
James from the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, formerly GDS team. What blockers are you coming up against? Where are you finding people are going, oh, no, I don't want you to do this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think I've done the best, or we've done the best value explanation of the value of this. So sometimes, like the 12 Springs of Scotland, I can show it to people who are quite high up, and they might just say, well, so what? And because they're not dealing with spreadsheets and trying to work out, what that means. So we have written a lot about what we're trying to do and trying to build like a message. But sometimes it's not the most pressing thing, and it's not seen as the highest value. We are doing quite remedial, boring work, and that's not always the way to excite people higher up. That's just a thing. The other thing we've got is there are people who've got, different visions, competing visions. That's normal. So trying to be as inclusive as possible, in that we are doing linked data and we are doing CSV stuff. But I guess we're trying to do an active standardisation. That there's lots of ideas, and then can we make something that works for everybody? And that's a lot of energy as well. I think. I mean, it'll live or die based on its value. Whether it works or not. So, although we might come across having hubris and, we're not doing it to people, we're trying to make something that works because if it doesn't work, then it's the wrong thing. So part of this, I think, if we can make progress with a few lists and we can start to show the value, then other people will want to participate. And if we've got it wrong, then, crikey, that'll be dreadful, wouldn't it, if we impose it across government. As Liam Maxwell says, people don't come to work in government for the money; they come to work to cock up at a national scale. And I wouldn't want that to be the outcome. So yeah, we're very careful about what we're doing.
Hi, it follows on nicely because you've just said it'll live or die depending on whether people use it.
Yeah.
But to some extent, the converse is true. People will use it if we think it's going to live. And I'm just wondering how we address that, because with how much confidence I can build an infrastructure which relies on these, and associated with that is, do you have DCAT-style metadata which talks about quality, timeliness, longevity, so that we can put some numbers to that?
So there's two questions there. So the second one I can answer quite quickly, which is, we can metadata is something you can generate from the data. We can layer on top of it, and we are thinking. We are looking at those things, but actually they're things which I can generate OWL, I can generate, whatever you want, So
I guess I'm asking if there are standard fields where you say if you're going to create one of these, you've got to say who the custodian is, you've got to say how quickly you're going
so that's
to
the
update
service,
it, and that sort of stuff.
Got you.
And that's machine readable, and it gives us faith in its existence.
So there is a register of registers, and we're learning how to expand that. The service we're building for establishing a register will collect metadata. One of those things we're working on at the moment, for example, we don't have all the answers. So we're trying to work out what it means to be a custodian. Is that the organisation, or is that a person? That kind of thing. So we're just learning as we go along. The trust thing is really hard, right? So, I heard one organisation which was 150 years old say, we can't trust this other organisation which was 90 years old to be around forever, right? So trust is really hard, right? And I think the best thing we can do is just to start to give people ways of trusting us enough, but having ways of mitigating it if it does disappear. I mean, nothing's forever.
Rick Chandler, EMA. Really, I was wondering if you've got mechanisms for, you're looking inward, looking at outward, what other governments maintain about us. I mean, the good examples, the country domains in the internet with .uk. On everything else, I think it's GB.
Yeah.
We've got no way of influencing that. And, I mean, do you have mechanisms for influencing
So
other governments and what they say about us?
That's not me, but that's like people like Tony who are domain experts in that area. I know IANA used UK and ISO use GB. I mean,
always been GB for decades, and then all of a sudden.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of something which I could bike shed about, but I would defer to the people who are in those organisations. But government does represent itself at lots of standards bodies. So.
And another question from the internet, I think.
Yeah, we've got a question from John Adams from DFID, the Department for International Development, who asks, apart from CAT registers, what's the most important single register you could build in 2017? What would have the highest value?
Well, I mean, I was expecting somebody to go there, but I'll go there, shall I? So addresses. Everything happens somewhere. It's quite hard to, that's one of our blockers. We want stuff to be open. And I've built services where we've had to involve a contract lawyer to scale it. A seasonal service where suddenly we have lots of users and we don't know how to spin up more machines without talking to a contract lawyer. And that's what open source software saves you from. And I think with open data as well, I'm in the Open Data Institute, the value of open data, it just removes that friction. So there is work underway to explore options to how to get to an open address register. So I'm hoping that pays off.
Hello, Michael from Parliament. Where would the links live? So if you had a register of schools and a register of local authorities and a register of addresses, would there be a tie from the school to the authority or the school to the address?
There is, yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So it quickly becomes a whole data model and not just a...
Yeah, so it's emerging, really. We're definitely doing an emergent one. I know you've done your genius at like, big models, but the approach we're taking is working things out as we go along, and we have looked ahead. We looked far enough ahead to not be worried. So a good example of that is something like a local authority. So local authority is an organisation, has lots of different roles. So the joke is that so one of the things we learned from the local authority register was they're not hierarchical. People think they can go to the district council, and then when they don't get satisfaction, go to the county council and tell on them, and that's not how it works. So we don't have a hierarchy in the local authority register. We expect geography to explain that. So if there's a register of local boundaries that link to then you can start to work out what the overlap was. And similarly, if a local authority is doing food inspections, then the food authority register should tell you which one it is. And if a local authority is in charge of schools, again, the LA register would tell you whether that was the case.
As it grew over time.
I did put one in a blog post actually. I think there's one called How Registers Emerge, and I did sort of do a sketch of that. So it's like the tagging is by the things that link to it. So it's totally a linked data model. We're definitely thinking about that, but we're just trying to turn down the academic sort of, because we're trying to sell what we're doing. But it is linked data. Yeah.
Hi, Paul. I'm Brian Condon.
Hi.
I was really interested in your use of the term canonical.
Yeah.
Because, of course, I'm assuming you were using it in the kind of computer science sense of the uniqueness of the descriptor.
It's a Highland sense. There should be only
but
one.
There's also a kind of physics sense of using it, in that it's a statistical representation of the microstates of a system.
Wow.
And I was thinking about...
I'm scared now.
Yeah. Maybe you should be scared. I was thinking about the disadvantages of using registers. I mean, you've been very clear about the advantages.
Right.
But it seems to me there are some inherent disadvantages. And I'm thinking now about resilience.
Yeah.
And also the very fact that the uniqueness that you're looking at in a register, surely that creates a kind of vulnerability. And I know it's confusing if there are 14 different sources of policy, but if you reduce all those sources of policy to one source...
And then that gets tampered with or gets lost.
And so I'd be interested to hear your kind of thinking about that.
Right, so I used the word Horcrux earlier, which is basically saying, I think it's just the way government is. There's one land registry, and well, it's not actually. There's one in Scotland as well, but there's one place where statements are made, and we're just trying to say, okay, the statements that organisation's making should be, the source of truth for something. But if that's not to say that we're trying to create, because I'd rather have a mess than the wrong abstraction, which I think is probably where you're going a little bit. And so in that respect, I think a list of local authorities as being legal entities with a town hall or whatever, and then a list of waste authorities kind of gets that where you don't sort of say, okay, we're going to tag things in one place. We're going to sort of like have things linked to it. And then the other thing in terms of the data, the idea is it being open. The open data is a brilliant way to get backups. Your website, my website went bang, and I went to archive.org because they could copy it. So the more copies that people have, the better. And some of the things we're trying to do with proofs is say, I've got a copy of a register. Is it good? Has it been tampered with? And if lots of people have got copies, then we can start to be a bit less scared about the one thing going away.
I was sort of thinking about being approximately right rather than being completely wrong, if you see what I mean. Precisely wrong, approximately right rather than precisely wrong. But
so I think maybe the thing to reassure people about is we are talking about administrative data here, like data that has a reason to exist in terms of can I drive a vehicle is a binary question. But if you want to do something like GDP or something, you want data from lots of different sources which are probably not administered at all. And so I think statistical approaches, that's a different mindset, and we can help that a little bit, but it doesn't answer it. I mean, you need statisticians to do statistical work. Yeah.
Cool. Any more questions in the room? That's enough. So actually, just one from me.
Okay.
Which is, so as I think of these things, I think they're brilliant, and I think the whole concept of getting the data out there so people can build easier services on it. And going back maybe to the point around authoritative and canonical.
Yeah.
Are there uses for registers outside of government? So, for example, a supermarket chain saying, "Here's our register of our supermarkets."
Yeah, I think Food Standards Agency, I was saying, I think I really like them because they do think about their public task and they look for data in lots of different places that, so you have to be careful about some of that stuff, obviously, but, I think they are canny enough to be careful. The work we're doing is in the open. It's open source software. We're trying to create standards that other people can adopt and contribute to. So, if it's got value to a supermarket chain, there's nothing, we couldn't stop them from using it because we've licensed it in such a way they can use it and we can't stop them. So I think this idea about, so there are lots of lists of things like conveyancers and GPs and which aren't, it's not clear to me because I don't know, I haven't really looked at them too closely, but I think the list of conveyancers is maintained by the Law Society. So for government to trust their list, maybe there's some things they could do rather than us keeping our own lists and observing what the Law Society is doing. Maybe we could push things out, but that feels like a long way off, before we would actually go to them and say, use this, because we can't. Well, we can't impose it on them, that's the whole point, but we also probably haven't got a brilliant offer yet.
Cool. Thank you very much. So I think that brings us to the end today. Thank you very much, Paul.
Okay.
And thank you for the questions we got in. For anybody watching at home, so next week's lecture is stuff that our labs team have built. Now, I think I meant to summarise that as it's an internet-connected shed, a quantified buoy, and an internet of poo. They're actually a darn sight more useful in solving real social problems than those descriptions may sound. There's actually some stuff about it in Wired magazine last week. So have a look for that. It's going to be a great little talk again, things you can really do practically at home. Thanks very much.